Look, hello and welcome everyone to our webinar on adaptive leadership and why it's critical leaders have an adaptive mindset. I've been looking through the registration list for today and I see we have some people from a broad range of industries across Australia and South Asia. So it's really both a good morning and a good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from. I'm Glenn Campbell, your moderator for today and the CEO at DeakinCo. At DeakinCo, our expertise and focus is on building and recognising the workforce capabilities that are essential for organisations and individuals to adapt to a changing work landscape. We've structured today's session as a conversation, and I'll introduce our panel members in a moment. But before I do that, I'd just like to run through a couple of housekeeping matters. The first one is that this webinar is being recorded. We'll also modify it and make it available to you after today's event. I'd encourage you to join the conversation today with a hashtag DeakinCo Adaptive. We've scheduled 45 minutes for panelist input, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. To post your questions, please use the Q&A function. And you'll find that for those not familiar with the webinar format of Zoom, you'll find that as an additional button on your menu log. So use that rather than the chat feature. And please, what we'll do as you make those questions throughout today, we'll seek to answer as many of them as we can towards the end of the webinar. And now for today's topic, adaptive leadership and why it is critical leaders have an adaptive mindset. The ability of a leader to bring an adaptive mindset to their role has proven critical as the world navigates increased rates of change. And also as organisations are forced to reassess their cultures and practices in order to adapt to what we can probably call the next normal. Organisations whose leaders are responsive to change and transformation have demonstrated time and again that they thrive under challenging circumstances and build robust cultures and teams. I think this ability, or the adaptive ability, can be a key differentiator to overcome adversity and underpin success in team collaboration, creative problem solving, and also enhanced workplace performance. To help us discuss and dissect what is really a critical workplace capability, we're joined by 4 talented HR and organisation development experts. First up today, we're joined by Sheree Savage. Sheree is the General Manager of HR at the ASX and is a highly experienced org development and HR professional with a background across the financial and professional services sectors here in Australia and throughout Asia. Joining Sheree is Dannielle Phelan, Group Manager Capability at Silverchain Group. Danny is a strategic capability and workforce transformation leader with specialist expertise in educational technologies, organisational development, learning design and leadership. Our third panellist is Gavin Freeman. Gavin is an organisational psychologist and director of the consulting firm Business Olympian Group. He's an author, keynote presenter, leadership coach, and has held positions of corporate senior psychologist and director of human resources. Gavin specialises in developing excellence in high-performing elite business people. Our fourth and final panel member is from Deakin University's Business School. Dr. Andrea North-Samardzic is the director of Deakin's MBA program. Andrea's areas of expertise include leadership, educational technologies, biometrics and ethics. I'd like to express my personal thanks to our panellists for joining us today. So let's start by asking a couple of our panellists about recent changes in organisational leadership. As they gather their thoughts, let's first define what we mean by an adaptive mindset. An adaptive mindset is the ability to develop and promote responsiveness and foster the capacity of individuals, groups, and the organisation as a whole to be adaptive. An adaptive mindset responds well to change. It embraces challenges as opportunities to innovate and to improve. Research shows us that leaders who model adaptive mindsets build cultures that respond positively to change and make the most of the opportunities it brings. This is vital in today's era of disruption, whether that be technological or even the odd global pandemic. And for those of you joining us again from Melbourne, I suppose as of tomorrow, we'll all be wearing masks indoors again. And certainly for those of us, and I know there are many here today that are joining us from India, of course, our deepest thoughts and where needed, the sympathies of what's been going on in your country certainly is with us, and we extend our warmest wishes to you all. Let's start with Danny. Danny, how has leadership changed?
Well, Glenn, it's been obviously an incredible 18 months, and certainly pandemics all in the forefront of our minds. And coming from a community aged and healthcare organisation that provides care in people's homes, certainly we've felt the intense impact of that pandemic. But before that and after the pandemic is over, we're in an industry that's constantly changing, very dynamic, and particularly when you work directly with people and when people are very central to your business, there's lots of dynamism and change that's constantly going on. So in terms of working in ways that are adaptable, it's more important than ever, and will continue to be incredibly important for our leaders to develop those capabilities. And they are, I believe, quite a different and continuing evolving set of capabilities that we need to focus on. So in terms of what about an adaptive mindset's so critical for us in the care sector, I would say it's that ability to really harness the energy, the intelligence of our teams, and to get people working together quickly and productively in agile ways to solve problems that we encounter, and to also, I guess, harvest that intelligence to solve problems as we move forward, and to innovate and be creative so that we can provide better services for the people of Australia.
Great, thanks, Danny. Gavin, I'd like to get your input and take on this question around how leadership has changed.
I agree with everything Danny said, but I'd expand it to add one additional layer, which is around not only are leaders having to adapt the way that they think to potentially change their current ways of thinking, whether it's their belief systems, their loyalties, the way they've viewed the world in the past, and being really open to allowing a new way of thinking. So don't think of good and bad. It might just be old versus new, but also it's about helping them engage those around them to go on that journey as well. And as leaders are facing all these challenges and are seeing, I guess, new challenges coming at them that they've never seen before, it's that recognition that so are their teams and so are their groups around them. And so it's about taking them on the journey as well, not just standing up and saying, hey, I'm going to be adaptive and I'm going to do all these interesting things. I've got to recognize that my team's got to come with me, and I've got to they've got to become adaptive in and of themselves. So it's that part of the two. I think the two hands have got to go together. And that's a challenge, because for some leaders, this is quite new to their way of thinking as a starting point. And now we're also asking them to bring on their teams, and different environments are going to have hugely different challenges ahead in front of them. Those that are comfortable with that more adaptive way, or sort of done it in the past, are going to find it easier. Those that are far more, or have been far more restrictive or conservative in their approaches in the past, may struggle a little bit as we move forward.
Thanks, Gavin. We are in the middle of what we can really only describe as an unprecedented, there's that magic word again. I promised myself I wouldn't mention it, but I just slipped out. But we really are in an era that really has a lot of disruption from all directions. We have social, environmental, and market changes. changes that we've been asked to respond to in what really has been quite a rapid and record time. I'm keen for us now to explore with each of the presenters how this has influenced organisational leadership. So I might move over to Sheree. Sheree, our leaders have been pulled from pillar to post over the last 18 months. My question, I think, is in two parts. The first part of it is really, what are some of the actions and behaviours that you've noticed in how leaders have been responding? And the second part to it is, are there any critical attributes you would say leaders show to succeed?
Thanks, Glenn. Thanks for the question. Actually, sort of reflecting on what Dannielle and also Gavin were saying, the behaviours, leadership behaviours and the thinking that was at the forefront during the sort of crux of the pandemic. The leaders that were most successful were those that, as we've said, did embrace the change as a platform to spring from, to create even more change, and to embed some of the changes that were in response to the pandemic, embed them as permanent changes to the way the team would operate and work. The other leadership attribute that worked particularly well was a very whole of person approach to team members. So as opposed to a task focused leader. So creating or focusing even more on creating trust in employment relationships, having mutual commitments to each other, focusing on engagement and approaching the pandemic and the work that was in front of us to be done as a partnership, as opposed to as Gavin mentioned, an old-fashioned control way of leading. Leaders that focused on getting that collaboration across the hybrid teams, so across the organisation, being able to encourage and almost force that collaboration, even though we were geographically disparate from each other. And again, I would use the word innovation, and just being able to say, okay, now we're in this situation almost overnight, where some leadership mindsets could have changed incrementally over a number of years and perhaps got to where we are today in terms of the way we work, flexibility, etc. That almost happened overnight as we all evacuated the building. And so a change in leadership was almost forced upon people, which was a good thing. I think that answers your question, Glenn.
No, thank you, Sheree. Danny, I wanted to just go back on a couple of things that you mentioned. You were talking about why that adaptive mindset is so critical for leaders in the care sector. I'm wondering if you could actually just elaborate a little bit more on what you were talking about then.
So we certainly in the care sector work directly with people. It's a people-centered business. So our people are very important, and also the clients that we work with are very important. And when you're in that environment, it is constantly changing. So in the care sector, you don't really see this kind of incremental structured change moving forward. And nothing really brought that home more so than the COVID pandemic, where things were changing from hour to hour, certainly at the beginning of the pandemic, and our teams needed to adapt and change. And I absolutely agree with what Gavin and Sheree have said. The real secret sauce, I guess, of making that a success, of being able to adapt and change in a way that helps people feel positive so that we can thrive, so that we can actually improve and hold on to some of the changes that we've made as we move forward, is really involving our people, taking them on the journey, helping them to be part of the solution, asking for their ideas, communicating, making communication such a early and important part of that journey, which is something that we certainly focused on doing. And taking the positives out of the situation, obviously a broadly very negative situation, but looking for where you can make positive organisational changes as a result of the things that we've all gone through together, and that collective journey we've all been on. Some of the beautiful lessons around collaboration. I work for a national organisation, and just the huge step forward I think we've taken in terms of collaboration nationally with our colleagues, being able to work together and generate ideas together, and build friendships together in new ways. And certainly in our industry, where we have a lot of our people obviously working independently, building opportunities for trust and empowerment for those individuals that are out there providing care in the community is incredibly important for us. So I would say, taking the positives, learning from them, and absolutely bringing everyone with us on the journey, making that journey our journey, not a journey that leaders are taking people on.
Well, thank you very much, and some really great insights from both yourself and Sheree. Andrea, if I can pose a question to you, and my question is, if I'm a leader and I want to be more adaptive, where do I start?
Great question. There's not one answer to fit everyone, but what I do want to highlight here is that adaptive mindsets, we can't really talk about adaptivity unless we talk about resilience. That's where adaptive mindsets and adaptive capacity really comes from. So, I'm an academic, so if I don't give you a definition of something, they'll kick me out of the uni. So here goes. Resilience is the process of adequate adaptation in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, or significant stresses of any kind. Now, we're all going through these significant events right now as a global population, which means that whether you know this or not, you are building up your resilience. What is really critical for leaders is to sit back, stop, and reflect on how they are doing this adaptation so that it emerges from being a subconscious exercise to an actual conscious, deliberate act of adapting and doing so in a more strategic way. And so really, your adaptive mindset is a combination of all the knowledge, skills, and capabilities that you have that help contribute to your resilience as well. So think about adaptive mindsets and resilience hand in hand, but start from yourself and think how you have been adapting and engaging in practices of resilience in your acts of leadership throughout the past year. Reflect on those and then make deliberate steps to ensure you're doing it consciously, because that way you can actually improve upon them. You can't improve what you don't know you're actually doing. So that would be my recommendation, Glenn.
Great. Thanks, Andrea. And I'll just turn to Gavin. What skills or, say, critical factors, culture or characteristics are needed to support a transition into adaptive leadership?
So I loved Andrea's talk about resilience. I spent a lot of my life working with individuals who had to develop resilience in a significant way. To answer your question, I probably want to go back one or two steps. And I think we also need to explore and understand the organisational environment or the organisational landscape that these individuals are operating within. And I think there also needs to be this insight around the agility that the organisation has to allow for. Because if the organisation hasn't considered how it may allow for the adaptation to adapt, then quite frankly, nothing's going to happen. You're going to get hit up against whether it's deep ingrained processes or systems in place. So we do need to bring up a whole of systems thinking approach in the way organizations actually fit and work together. Underpinning that, there's got to be some kind of a shared future. If we don't have alignment across business, and I'm talking not only at the small businesses with small functions, but also to those large multinationals. We've all got to make sure that we're on the same bus. And I know that's a similar analogy. But then we do need to come down to at the individual level. There's some skills that we can work with. While I love resilience as a concept, I think if we take that back and think about where does some of this come from, there's a number of mental models that come into play around ways we can look at developing leadership. And the one that often pops up in this situation is that the fundamental difference between those with fixed mindsets versus those with growth mindsets. And if we're going into situations with a very fixed mindset, it's going to be very difficult to adapt. And the growth mindset it doesn't really matter how you define it. Really, I'm less of an academic than Andrea, so I don't mind the definitions. But if you just think of that growth mindset of being able to stretch and give yourself permission to stretch, I think that's the other side of it. With any form of challenges, whether it's being adaptive or anything else, there is going to be elements of failure that come into play. So we need to be able to recognize that failure is just part of this journey and we need to learn from it. So that continual development, recognizing a growth mindset is, I think, vital. Clearly being resilient, absolutely. But having that growth mindset to say, I'm going to stretch myself, I'm going to try, I'm going to explore, I'm going to challenge, because we may have to challenge well-held belief systems from the past to overcome them to move into something forward into the future. So I think there's lots of different areas. It really comes down to the organisation having, I guess, giving people the opportunity to think that way, but the individuals to taking that on. There's nothing worse than the closed-minded individual who says, no, this is never going to work, or we've tried this before, it'll never happen again, or it never worked in the past. But those are, I guess, a couple of initial thoughts to get us started on the conversation.
Danny, if I can connect what Gavin has just outlined with what you were talking about earlier, to ensure these characteristics are in place, how would you go about seeking to identify them in a workplace and then bring them to life? What would be the must-haves?
So the must-haves. So in terms of a leader's ability to, I guess, develop their adaptive qualities, I would certainly say absolutely spot on with Gavin, that growth mindset and a sense of positivity and optimism. Obviously, developing those capabilities in an organisation as part of the broader culture. So having, I guess, an imperative, a mandate, a vision from the organisation that working in adaptive, flexible ways is important, and also a culture where collaboration is really central. So helping a leader to build collaboration with their teams. And when I think about a leader's ability to be adaptive, I tend to go to those leaders that humble is a way of describing it, but they don't want to bring their expertise to solve every problem. They want to tap in to the expertise in their teams. They're not coming at problems with a playbook that they run through in the same way every time they encounter something in the workplace. They actually reach out to their teams. And I really love that idea of an adaptive leader being a leader that could lead any kind of initiative in an organisation, regardless of whether they're an expert or not, because the focus is on tapping into the people that they work with, and ideally, more broadly, their clients or the community as well. So looking at those kind of co-design models. So the capabilities I would really stress and highlight would really be around communication, empathy, being able to engage with your teams, bringing a sense of positivity and optimism, and also being able to help the team feel that as well. So playing it back to people, helping them to understand the progress and the success, and focusing on that too. I think it's really important to help your teams maintain that momentum that you need, because it's not a change you work through and stop. It's a constant process.
Yeah. No, thanks, Danny. I'd like to just throw that same question open to everyone on our panel. What do you see as those must-haves in bringing this in?
So for me, something that I think we need to also acknowledge around adaptive mindsets is the concept of creativity, about people willing to engage not just in traditional ways of doing things, but they are engaging at an emotional level with any type of activity that they're undergoing. So anyone that is willing to put their hand up for any new exercise, do videos. Explore in a more creative space indicates to me that, you know what, that sense of play, that sense of courage indicates that they're okay with putting themselves out there. There may be failure or there may not be the success that they'd like, but they'll learn from the process and start again. So, I want to echo what Danny's saying around being humble, but there's also that sense of, well, if I mess up, it's not so bad. So maybe I don't know, how would I articulate that? Confidence, but not being arrogant, that you're okay to be a bit silly. And
Yep. Thanks.
But even within that, for me, I live in a constant loop of failure, and I love that as a mindset. It's that it's just a continual learning process rather than it being seen as a negative evaluation of yourself or by others. And I think all too often people get caught up in this mindset of being motivated to avoid failure. So it's still motivated, and the key word there is still motivated. It's not the fear of failure, it's this motivation to avoid the failure. So we take the path of least resistance. We don't put our hand up. We don't, want to try to shine because we might be seen as a failure. So we still do a good enough job. We still try really hard, but we just don't do that extra step because of this overall fail. And so that also comes back to the way organizations create that environment. And I think there's a lot to be said about recognizing what are the enemies of adaptability? What are some of the barriers that organizations will either unwittingly or without even realizing it, they put things up to stop this from happening. And I think a lot of organizations may be very clear in saying, we want our leaders to be adaptable, we want to create this new environment. And yet if they were to then take the step back and actually have a look at what are some of the barriers that are inherently in their business, they might be a little surprised to see that they in fact have hierarchies that cause problems because decisions have to go too far up a tree. There's inflexible business practices, or maybe it's a short-term bonus thinking. You've got to get a bonus here. So I don't want to steal everybody's time, but I think there's also a lot of insights around what are some of the barriers that organizations have put up that potentially will get in the way.
And you raise a good point there in terms of performance management and what we're rewarding. And if you're only rewarding your meat and potatoes KPIs, then where is the incentive to do anything new and differently? So it's about situating it in a culture and structures that really support and encourage these behaviours.
I asked the group the other day, which team do you want to be on? And you're all going to show your age and insights if you know the answer to this question. Do you want to be on the group that invented WD1, or do you want to be on the group that was on WD39? And it's always really interesting to see, for those of you who don't know, WD-40 was the final group that, found the formula for the spray that we all use. But group 1 failed miserably. And if you had a choice, which group do you want to be on? Everyone picks 39, except they didn't know 39 was going to become 40. And so that, also talks to how we deal with and set that up.
Yeah. And you're right. We learn so much more from reflecting on failure than we do from reflecting on success. Case methodology teaching is in fact grounded in looking at what went wrong and how do you overcome that in the future. Sheree, I mentioned earlier that really for the past 18 months, there has been a significant disruption to our operating and physical environments. Digital transformations have accelerated and business demand has also shifted quite significantly. Sheree, in talking with your peers and other leaders, how do you feel leaders will remain open to leveraging an adaptive mindset, or have you observed blockages for leaders?
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. There is definitely a desire to leverage the lessons that we've learned over time and to continue, focusing less on FaceTime and more, there's more belief now in remote work, less of an activity focus, more focusing on outcomes, less of a focus on task, as I mentioned before, and the new understanding and continuing that understanding and focus of the importance and value of team relationships and the emotional connection that people have, and focusing on the whole of person, as I mentioned before. I think the main blockages or barriers to that, some leaders, and we've spoken about them just earlier, who actually do want things just to snap back to the way that the way things were before. So that was their comfort zone. They were, you know, not comfortable with the flexibility and sort of democracy that is now in this this new way of working. And some of those leaders were those that had difficulty working through the pandemic and just felt comfortable with the way things were. And I think picking up on Gavin's point, underneath all of that is more of a fixed mindset, as he said, rather than a growth mindset. So particularly a leader who may have historically relied on fear and control will feel very threatened by this new way of working. And probably the other thing I would add to that is, and I think Gavin mentioned it earlier, you know, we can't assume that all leaders inherently have these, you know, adaptive approaches to work, adaptive mindsets. And so what we've done at ASX is tried to build that capability within our leadership cohort, primarily in two ways. So the HR team created and launched a hybrid working hub, which was information and resources for all employees, but particularly focused on helping managers with some of these new situations that they hadn't had to manage before, including difficult conversations around flexibility, making sure people are safe at home, identifying stress in remote teams and what do you do about that, how to hold an inclusive meeting when everybody's on different sites. So that hybrid working hub was very well received by our leaders in terms of just resources and guidance for them. And the other thing that we've launched and is currently in play is our leadership development program through DeakinCo. So Glenn and Gavin have been instrumental in uplifting our leaders in terms of being more adaptive in their mindset and also leading hybrid teams. So we've got 8 webinars, small group coaching, in-person simulations and workshops planned. And that's another way of addressing the acknowledgement that this doesn't come easily or doesn't come naturally to all leaders.
Yep, no, thanks. In fact, about an hour and a half ago, I was having a very similar conversation with a couple of people about another industry where this was in fact a widespread situation that they were finding across their entire industry. But Gavin, given the type of work that you do, I'm wondering whether this is I suppose, a common response.
Okay, so we've got to look back and see how people have learned over time. And I think if we take a historical view of the way we have trained individuals, the way we traditionally go through our learning programs from school through TAFEs and universities and the like, we see how we start to develop the way people think. And ultimately, the brain is always looking for the path of least resistance. So the brain wants patterns and it likes to look for patterns. So the more patterns I create, the more comfortable I feel. The more comfortable I feel, the more efficient I'm going to be, and therefore more productive. What this is doing now is it's putting a bit of a spanner in the works to some degree. So we're no longer seeing the connection between me being efficient through these patterns that I've used in the past and now productivity. And so we're getting a disconnect there. So we're having to relearn new patterns, and that can be quite challenging. And I think some industries are going to address this much easier and quicker versus others. And it's not about trying to pick which industries are going to be better at it or not, but there are clearly industries that have been well entrenched in the way that they do things. And therefore, even the process of just trying to train people to do things differently or to challenge them to do things differently is going to be, I would suggest, probably somewhat onerous. But I do see significant uplift when you do put new information in front of individuals. The one thing that I'm always heartened by is that even sometimes when you get a group that says, no, they're never going to change. They're never going to change the way they do things. They're well entrenched. is by taking them on a pathway of not just educating them, because I don't think people will acknowledge education from a cognitive perspective. Yes, that makes sense. It's really about putting them then face to face with that scenario, giving them the opportunity. And it's more than just role plays. It's actually challenging them in the real world. But to do that, you've got to have that systems thinking. So it's got to be across the business and up and down through the channels. So I think there's methodologies that we can use that will take that on. But it very much starts with, we've got to put people face to face with this new way of thinking. We've got to educate them in different ways. We may not be able to use the old style of thinking. You know, Sheree did mention just the work that we're doing with ASX, but in the past, you may have done 3, 4, 5-day workshops and realized that that's not getting enough cut through. This time around, we're using short, sharp, single focus approaches. And that gives us, you know, a single hit at a particular philosophy, and then we move on in the next stages. So maybe it's a different way of thinking. People will change. Sometimes they're just slower and sometimes a little faster, but I think it's start with the education, put them face to face, let them experience it, and then ultimately let them teach others. And that's usually a nice, really recipe for success.
Thanks, Gavin. If I can just follow up on one extra piece there. What does adaptive leadership look like for people who aren't naturally resilient?
Well, I think people are actually far more resilient than we actually give ourselves credit for. I often find, and so one of the things you didn't mention in my intro is I actually spent the first part of my life working with Olympic athletes and Olympic hopefuls. And so we would see resilience starting at fairly young ages. I think sometimes people compartmentalize their resilience. So they might think I'm resilient in one space, but they're not in another. So I actually don't buy into the fact that people aren't resilient. I think we need to allow them to see it. Notwithstanding that, if I take your question on point and say, well, if somebody isn't resilient, then I think it really does defer back to the organisation in the way they wrap around support and services around these individuals, whether it's, you know, particularly now, whether it's around additional EAP or support for leaders who are trying to deal with their people who they've never had to deal with them in this particular way before. When, you know, most leaders out there don't have a psychology degree, but yet we're asking them to take on many of those roles in this space now. So I think it's incumbent on organisations to recognise an EAP is fantastic, but it may not be enough. We may need to have a wrap around more services. So if you're lacking the resilience, look to the organisation. And I think there's then other ways to be able to support those individuals. We don't want to just say, oh, well, you're not resilient, so don't worry about it. Off you go, you can go sit in the corner and not have to do anything. I think it's okay to hold people's hand through this process, give them guidance, whether it's mentoring, coaching, or the like. But I do think it's possible. It'll require a little bit of creativity, back to some of the earlier comments from some organisations, to think about how do we support our people through this time.
If I could just jump in there and say that everyone has resilience. You survived the pandemic. Congratulations. You have resilience. This has been a significant global traumatic event. So, you know, this concept of resilience as well is very subjective. People can go through different experiences and have it affect them in different ways due to different vulnerabilities. So as long as you can get people to, you know, hook themselves into their stories and say, this is how I responded, this is how I adapted, I am therefore resilient, they'll have that self-belief to behave in an adaptive way. So if you survived 2020, congratulations, you have resilience.
Thanks, Andrea. If I can ask you another question. Andrea, in your role as MBA director, you have constant access to emerging and established leaders. What insights do you have relating to really that conversation we've just had that was started by Sheree and Gavin?
I think that in terms of adaptive leadership within the context of MBA with emerging and existing leaders, the ones where I can see greatest adaptivity are those that actively want to work in cross-disciplinary teams that say, I'm in healthcare, I don't want to be working with anyone in healthcare because I want to draw from different experiences. Give me the people from professional services. I want the military people. I want to be challenged and learn and grow. So those who actively seek out experiences with diverse others. And so I think we also need to acknowledge the importance of diversity in adaptive mindsets as well, because the more you've worked with people from different diverse backgrounds, the more you've got those expanded mental models that Gavin referred to. So for those that want to work in different syndicate teams, want to stretch themselves, work with new and different people, different ages, different races, genders, sexualities, and backgrounds. Those are the ones that indicate that they're ready to throw themselves into the deep end and have these new experiences and learn and grow from them.
Thanks.
There's something there. Sorry, Glenn, one other thing I might want to just add to that. I think there's a lesson learnt in that the way that the MBA teaches and gets the groups to work together in ways that organisations can. I have my favourite saying is steal with pride. You know, why don't we steal something from our friends in academia?
As the MBA director, do not sell our secrets. They have to enrol to learn the secrets, Gavin.
I'll put a reference down the bottom.
Yeah, okay.
But we think about often what leaders will do is they will almost close up shop and say, right, I've got to solve this problem for me now, rather than potentially taking that idea of diversity around the group and actually bringing leaders together and say, why don't you look at this as a bit of a collective? Why don't you get together with 3 or 4 of your, counterparts from very different parts of the business and just almost, mirror that description there of syndicate groups looking at a problem, because we know that level of diversity or that lens of diversity is almost 3 steps into solving parts of our challenges. If you're just sitting there staring at it going, I don't know what to do here, jump down the road and find out what other people are doing. Ask people to come into your environment and say, can you just come have a look here and tell me what I'm missing or what are you seeing that I'm not seeing? Can be really, really powerful. And then go do an MBA with Andrea. Yeah, is that good? Yeah, okay.
Thanks very much. I'd like to just move towards some of the questions that are starting to come in from our audience. And the first one I have here is from Radha. To shift from the fixed mindset to a growth mindset, what sort of learning approach in terms of skills and capabilities one needs to develop at the operational level? And especially when the mindset is somewhere related to personality.
Seeing that I brought this one up, why don't I have a first crack at it, and then feel free, everyone else can jump in on this. I guess the assumption you're making is that the one sort of blends into the other. You don't start with a fix and then suddenly become a growth mindset. I think so. Part of it is at some level a decisional making aspect to say, I'm going to recognize it as an alternate way of doing things. The challenge is, depending on how ingrained that fixed mindset poses the broader challenge around how do you potentially go to break it down. I've seen some organizations have a systems approach to doing this by providing guidance, education, opportunities, particularly when you take an individual out of where their fixed mindset is being further reinforced by their workplace. So if my job is to do X and my fixed mindset supports me in X, if you move me into Y and say, I'd like you to now go work in Y, I'll share a great example. I did some work overseas. I was in Mongolia, and the way that they challenged their fixed mindset was they asked individuals who were at the general manager level to move to general manage other parts of the business that they had no background in. So the head of finance, the CFO, spent time managing the marketing department. Now, what happens there is you actually have permission to use the growth mindset because your fixed mindset doesn't apply. So you've almost gone one completely to another. So if you've got someone who's super fixed in their spot, a nice, quick and easy way is move them out, put them in another area and say, right, you're not expected to have a fixed mindset here, have a think. So that's kind of one start. I'm happy for others to jump in with any other ideas. Otherwise, I'll fill the space. I've got a few more.
Thanks. I just ask just to call out to our audience, as some of the questions are starting to come through. So please, if you have questions yourself or any of the panelists, just enter them into using the Q&A function on your menu bar. I'll just take another question, and this is open to all our panelists. What would you say to a leader who wanted to return to a before COVID leadership style?
Good luck.
I'd actually try and, well, good luck would be my first instinct, but I'd actually want to ask why. Really uncover the underlying reasons, because, we always talk about change, but we're always afraid to talk about what we're prepared to give up. But for change to happen, someone has to give up something, whether it's time, money, resources, power. So they may feel more powerless in this environment because they aren't able to have more control. And so it's really about them feeling uncomfortable with a changing power dynamic. I mean, that's just, you know, talking through the problem there. So I think uncovering the why will be really critical.
There is something about what do they mean by the old versus the new? You know, is it the new because I'm managing my team in a new way and I don't? So one question that often gets posed to me at the moment now is, how do I performance manage people because I can't see the work that they're doing? Because the best I get is I can see Dr. Dre in front of me on my screen. So, but do I know she's working? I can't tell because I can't see what her background is. Her fingers aren't typing, so clearly she's not doing any work. I think that's one of the challenges that's often being presented, is how are managers managing performance, particularly in areas that don't have financial metrics automatically attached. So, you know, managing a group of salespeople, you can see the metrics coming out pretty easily. But let's be honest, a lot of us don't have those very key metric-based deliverables around the work that we do. So that's the one area I've seen a lot of managers come talk to me about and challenged as to how do they shift that. And some of it's to do with trust. So back to Andrea's point, is the why is because there's a bit of loss of trust in that space. Do I trust my people that they're actually doing the job that they say that they're going to do? And that can be quite an eye-opening conversation when you start to unpack, well, what does trust mean in this new environment? Because it may mean something, it may look very different. So that's one example where I've spent a fair bit of my time actually over the last little while discussing that kind of a concept.
That's interesting, Gavin, because I would add to that, and that going through the change requirements of a leader through this period, I think has illuminated the fact that perhaps they weren't, you know, those leaders weren't managing performance in a very transparent, clear, accountable way in the first place. And it came across in the first instance as managing activity. It was never about managing outcomes. And now it's forced to be about outcomes, and they don't have any experience or expertise to start doing that. So it's actually highlighted problems that pre-existed the pandemic period.
Well, it's a good opportunity now to revisit that whole aspect of performance management.
That's right.
Yep. Gavin, you earlier mentioned closed-mindedness. How can leaders support adaptive followership?
Oh, we don't have enough time to go through that one, Glenn, because I think that's a whole different kettle of fish. So yeah, I mentioned that point at the beginning to say, look, it's got to be the leaders that it starts, and then you've clearly still got your team to come through. One starting point that comes to mind is around shared accountabilities. So when I look at high performing teams, often, and I know I'm being very stereotypical in my answer here, but it'll make my point. Often we had the scenario where when we win as a team, and when we lose, it's the boss's fault, right? So boss takes all the blame when we lose, but when we win, we'll share in that. I think part of developing adaptive followership is making sure that there's shared accountabilities throughout the team. So as a leader, I may have accountabilities to a variety of different aspects within my team. If I'm a follower, I'm a member of that team, I need to understand what my accountabilities are as well. And I think if you start there and people are really clear around what that is, it's probably a good place to start with building that followership within an adaptive mindset. So you don't want to end up people sitting back, kind of throwing stones over the fence and looking and seeing what the leader does and then deciding whether they'll jump on board or not. You want to get them early on to sign up and understand we're all part of a team, but we all have different accountabilities within this team.
Thanks. We have a question from Roz. How do you best highlight adaptive leadership with a future employer? Often they have a view you have moved around, but this can be intentional. How can you best highlight adaptive leadership with a future employer?
My 2 cents, I'll put out there before ceding the floor to anyone else, is that as long as you've got a clear narrative to explain how and why and what you've learned from each one, and fit that back into your overall leadership philosophy and approach to leadership. So showing how that's actually contributed to the wonderful toolkit that you have as a leader now. And I think that it can be really hard sometimes to convince people that, yes, I have changed jobs or industries, and that's an asset rather than a curse. But that it really comes down to framing. And fortunately, I think that people are more open now to drawing from expertise from different industries, as long as you frame the capability as translatable across industries.
Yep. And I think there's a flip side to this one. And I've worked in a variety of different industries as well. Is that if you're the sort of person that values that, and you're going for a job with an employer that doesn't, you're not going to be a good fit. We have a question from Neil. Hi, Neil. Adaptive leadership is often described exclusively in a reactive sense. How do you help leaders adapt their style to proactively support future goals rather than only reacting to today's issues and problems?
That's an interesting one, I think. You know, the idea that being adaptive is adapting to a situation reactively rather than a mindset that supports, I guess, constant change and innovation. So in terms of adaptive leadership capabilities and getting the ability to move proactively, I really like the idea of that, getting up on the balcony and getting a good view of what's happening and being able to actually see adaptive leaders as those leaders who are prepared, who are so involved with the work that the organisation's doing, and they're passionate about it, that they're prepared to get out up on the balcony and look at ways to improve more broadly and who they could work with. And, you know, sometimes we hear this idea of, and it's a more traditional leadership idea of swimming in your lane or, you know, staying in your lane, but they're the leaders that are prepared to swim outside their lane, make contacts with people within the organisation, outside the organisation, because they're passionate about what they do and working with other people to improve the way they do it. So in my mind, that's the way I really see adaptive leadership. It's about being passionate about improving and positive about that idea rather than necessarily just reacting to things that happen.
Right.
I agree with you, Danny. I actually don't see it as being, I can understand the reactive comment, but I actually think it needs to be proactive to be effective. Because if you're not proactively opening yourself up to opportunities or looking for things, you might then react when those things present themselves. And if, you know, ideally you want to get on the front foot, but I actually see it being incredibly proactive, because you're needing to not just set the scene for yourself, but you're also needing to set the scene or the environment for your organization. Well, one quick insight, when we think about creating an innovative place to work, well, you can't have an innovative place to work unless you've got unless you've got permission to be innovative in the culture. Yeah. So if there's no permission to be innovative, then you can create all the hubs in the world. You can have all the hackathons you like. No one's going to actually contribute or believe that anything's going to happen if you actually don't have a culture of innovation. So I actually think we can set ourselves up for success here by being incredibly proactive. And then when things happen, I think we just react much quicker, or it looks like we're reacting much quicker, but we're actually on the front foot.
Thanks. Well, I think we have time for one last question. And this one probably actually has two different themes within the same question. Haven't we always been and needed adaptive leadership? Is this just a new narrative trend as a result of COVID?
Can I jump in there quickly as a leadership scholar who has dedicated her life to studying styles of leadership? Yes and no. Adaptive leadership has always existed. Think about military leadership, humanitarian leadership. Of course, you've had to adapt quickly in war zones. When we look about situational leadership that came out in the 60s and 70s, that was about matching your style to a situation, had adaptivity in there. What we're seeing now is it taking on more complex and nuanced dimensions, but also being across the whole population rather than just a requirement in certain industries and roles. Now everyone has to be adaptive, and also the way in which we address adaptivity by drawing from resilience and diversity are things that otherwise weren't recognised.
Thank you.
I'll step back now.
No,
Have my rant.
Thanks very much.
I agree with Andrea.
And that's a perfect place to end today's webinar on. So thank you, everyone. I hope all attendees today can take a few good insights away that they can reflect on, or even perhaps apply in their own work if it's not already being applied. Enjoy your afternoon. I think we're now all afternoon, or the rest of your morning, and then afternoon and your evenings. So all the best, and everyone, please stay safe.